I'm super excited for this panel with these awesome panelists. The name of the panel is "Does All Load Matter? Where Scale Meets Impact." Today, we're going to be examining whether all forms of load, from small community microgrids to hyperscale AI clusters, actually move the needle in energy markets. We answer whether smaller distributed operations contribute meaningful resilience, or if scale alone drives impact. But before we jump into the questions, I think it's really important to define something. So I'm going to start off with Steve. By the way, Steve's mustache is the best metric for the Bitcoin price. If you see it thicker, it's probably higher. If you see it completely shaved, we're at zero. Steve, good to see you. So let's define what is moving the needle in the first place.
I think my mustache is my identity now, and that needs to get updated, I think. And this is a big upgrade from Canada, by the way, this weather. So you guys are lucky. What was the question?
Completely forgot. Let's move on. Let's take it back. All right. So the question is, what defines moving the needle?
Moving the needle for just the utility of compute load, or
for energy markets in general?
I guess the usefulness of the application. Distributed computing, the stuff at the edge, flexible loads like Bitcoin mining. I think for our customer base and those people that know we're into the off-grid Bitcoin mining, it's often a way to enhance the oil and gas facility, like putting a distributed computing load on a well site to deal with a gas egress problem. Moves the needle for the customer if that makes them more oil, for example, if it's like an associated gas application. In the context of like massive loads on the grid, like massive computing loads like AI or Bitcoin mining, more customers is more demand. More demand breeds more resiliency on the grid. It incentivizes more investment in the infrastructure, like in the power gen. So I guess it depends on the context, but proper application of the technology is the big thing.
Would you say the Bitcoin mining industry is moving the needle at all?
Well, I think so. In off-grid, it's really the only scalable technology to capture stranded gas, for example, or underutilized generators. That's something AI compute isn't really capable of doing due to the needs of high uptime, power quality, high bandwidth. So even on the grid, it's everything's all the big mining companies, Riot, everybody now, CleanSpark, even one of the last holdouts to be pure play Bitcoin miner. A lot of them are pivoting or adding AI to their portfolio, but even before AI really took off and, ChatGPT made people like me who were pessimists on AI aware that it was going to be a big deal. I think it was already moving the needle, providing a flexible demand and for like power plants, especially, having a floor buyer, like a buyer of last resort, which is a Bitcoin computing load, and that can be just turned off without harming anybody. Like there's no real customer on the other side. It's the global network. It's not like you're not in a contract with somebody and you stop serving them compute. We get maybe a little bit slower block times, but on average, most Bitcoiners don't notice when massive facilities in Texas go down. So I think it was moving the needle for many years now, and we'll continue to do that.
I have a question for you. If the grid never sees those electrons, shout out Hafa, how is that moving the needle?
If the grid never sees it, so like the off-grid stuff, well, I don't know exactly what's going on in, say, the Tennessee region, but I think there's going to be more of a trend towards, if the U.S. in particular and the West in particular is very constrained on power generation. I've spent past panels here and elsewhere talking about how ESG is really bottlenecked the supply of electricity in the West. And whether it's Bitcoin or AI compute that can be now started off grid, like seeded, maybe a good example. I'm sort of assuming like companies like Stone Ridge Holdings acquiring all this natural gas assets across the U.S., the stranded gas. They're buying it up at a discount. They can now seed, if they do it strategically, they can seed massive. If I was them, I would be working on developing large AI and Bitcoin mining computing loads. And if you do it strategically, and it's, you can put these power plants also proximate to like industry, like maybe cities or wherever you can eventually get fiber. You can start off grid on a microgrid with a microgrid of gigawatts of power going to AI compute. And then that gets the ball rolling. That gets investors interested in basically building out the power. And then once that infrastructure is built out, whenever the utility and the red tape and the bureaucracy, as the time passes and that gets connected, now you can also serve the grid. So it's a means of seeding for investors, like giving them assurance to build power systems.
Beautiful. Tara, same question. What do you define as moving the needle? Is the needle even moving?
Yeah, the needle's definitely moving, and digital compute as a sector, which I look at HPC and Bitcoin mining, really exact same operating performance. You're looking to manage compute either at a 99.99% uptime or at least every 10 minutes, right? I mean, that's how a lot of these data centers work. But for moving the needle from an energy perspective, we've already seen digital compute massively changing how power is generated, how power is growing. I use a different term than Steve referenced. I consider digital compute offtake as the buyer of first resort of electrons, because really, if you have no other economic offtake, you can plug in either digital mining or HPC, depending on the characteristics of the site itself. It's been changing, again, to the ESG narrative you mentioned, how a lot of renewable power managers are looking at sites and development. You can now build an off-grid renewable power center and have Bitcoin mining basically be the off-taker. And 5 to 10 to 15 years, however long the transmission takes to develop, to get that electron stream to a population center, no longer requires billions of dollars of investment from public coffers, from taxpayers, from ratepayers. Suddenly, the Bitcoin mining network itself can generate the offtake, the economic incentive to develop that power. From a nuclear perspective, I mean, the data center industry is really waking people up to how stupid we were for not developing more nuclear power over the last 20 years, right? Like, data centers have woken up the society at large globally that we need more power. And that, yes, Bitcoin mining certainly utilizes a lot of electrons, but our entire way of life going forward is going to be requiring magnitudes more electrons to be created and generated. And nuclear power is a base foundation for that. And I know Google mentioned that they have to build every 6 months an additional multiple of their existing capacity to meet current demand. I mean, that's just one company. That's not Microsoft. That's not any of the other major data center operators globally. So power is 100% moved by this industry, and it's not going to stop.
Philip, how you doing, man?
I'm awesome down here.
We haven't spoken in 8 minutes.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
It's been a long time. Good to meet you, by the way.
Thank you.
Same question for you, my friend.
Yeah, no, I think I mean, I agree with what both these guys are saying, and I absolutely agree with this notion that Bitcoin mining is a buyer of both first resort and last resort. And I think that particularly when you look at energy sources that do not have a direct fuel cost. And you think about the fact that really it's the CapEx recovery in that generation asset that is ultimately driving the economics of that project. Why would you not use a buyer, even if they're not the highest paying buyer? It's better to sell it for something than to sell it for nothing. And I think the way that I tend to think about the Bitcoin network is that it's really a global free market that I can sell kilowatt hours to. It's always there. It's always willing to buy maybe, today it's a little bit lower, tomorrow it's a little bit higher. But the truth is, when you have an energy asset and you've invested in the CapEx and you're not having to pay a direct cost for the fuel to run that generation asset, then why would you not sell it, almost no matter what the price, to a buyer that's willing to pay you today, no questions asked, and pays you for whatever you put in? When I think about the future of kind of this data center movement, I think Bitcoin has certainly, set the benchmark of, I think, how we're going to think about data center infrastructure going forward. And I think it's interesting when you go back to the early days of Bitcoin mining, and people were doing it on GPUs because they were really flexible and you could do that. And then the economic incentive reached a point that, they designed the ASICs to allow us to be more efficient at doing that. I imagine we're going to go through that same cycle, over time with HPC. So ultimately, I see our job as Bitcoin miners is really to secure the energy assets, to secure the generation capacity, and then to sell to whichever market is ready to take that electricity, take that capital, so we can go build more energy assets. And certainly in my part of the world, that's the thing that matters most. I mean, we need a lot of new assets, and this is the economic enabler that allows us to do that.
Steve, if you were to give me one metric to prove impact, what would it be?
Well, I'd like to say, at least for on the grid perspective, would be generally rates going down would be a good metric, but I don't know in the near term we'll see that because of the supply constraint. Over time, I think I would like to see that happen, or it should in theory happen in my mind, because especially HPC compute, at least right now, the revenues are so high on a, like marginally per kilowatt hour, put through a GPU. If you can get reliable quality power, I don't think it's a big part of the overall cost compared to hardware depreciation and the like. So on a long term, as AI computing loads, Bitcoin computing loads increasingly connect to the grid, I'd expect to see rates for industry like factories, residences, commercial generally improve, but that's only after the supply catches up. In the short term, it's probably going to be the opposite, unless the utilities get creative and make especially the AI compute, which is not very flexible, pay a premium for the power, so the ratepayers don't have to pay as much. But that would be one metric. In the off-grid, like microgrid side, really it's funny because I don't know if it's like the ETFs coming online, the last 2 years, and more of the institutional adoption of Bitcoin, like the acceptance of Bitcoin. But we're seeing more and more, it's always a long sales cycle in the oil field, especially for Bitcoin mining, but we're seeing more and more big energy companies revisit the tech. And so, we just did a small pilot with a big oil company in the US, and they're self-mining. So seeing more of that happening, where they're actually, not, traditionally not just like asking for someone to pay them a little bit for gas, but they're actually making the investment in Bitcoin mining, to me is a good indicator of the maturity of the market. So seeing them adopt and implement the technology in the right way to enhance their business is really the major indicator. That makes me bullish still on the future of Bitcoin mining.
I asked you for one, but I'll take multiple. That works too. Taras, what's your metric when the load is migrating towards HPC expectations?
I would look at the metric of total power generation globally as the metric to be looking at, because as Steve mentioned, right now there's this lag between the mad rush that happened post World War II, where everybody in North America thought that we were going to have this massive manufacturing base, and then, as was discussed last week or this week in Davos, globalization took hold, and a lot of the manufacturing that was expected here didn't come, but we built the power. So there's a huge amount of capacity for gigawatt hours available that was never used, and that's being sopped up. And now suddenly, as mentioned earlier, nuclear is coming in, natural gas is coming in, and you're seeing the amount of capacity of gigawatt hours really increasing. I think that's the metric that we should all be looking at to see the lag and lead as to where we're actually seeing development of power generation itself, because that metric alone will then dictate everything else behind it. Because again, as I mentioned, we don't have the power needed for the amount of demand that we have for data center capacity. So it will be the leading indicator for how quickly we're growing or how slowly we're growing as an industry.
Philip, I'm going to give you a tough question. Define quality of load.
Uh, yeah, I think, and we talk about it a lot, but this flexibility, the ability to be there or not be there, essentially at a moment's notice, is a tremendous quality of a load. The ability to pay on a timely fashion, um, certainly you could have industries that will consume a lot of electricity, but maybe their sales cycle is long. They want long payment. I think having this reliable payer is a critical criteria of high quality loads. And then this location agnostic, the ability to put a load anywhere you want. I mean, when you think about like what we're doing in Africa, like some of our sites are a 2-day trip, a hard 2-day trip. You're not going to put logistics infrastructure to set up a factory and move raw materials in and pull finished goods out. And it's not a place that most people would want to go set up any kind of industrial consumer of, power. But the fact that you have a high quality load that you can stick in the middle of nowhere, you can push your electricity to it, you can get paid for that electricity. It's an absolute game changer in terms of, I think how we think about the future of electricity. And I mean, obviously, it's in our name, but we see that moving away from this notion of fully centralized grids, particularly for the areas that don't have access to energy today, it's ultimately going to be a gridless model. And I don't mean gridless with a capital G, but like it's going to be an off-grid model where you essentially have to bring that industrial load with you. You need, whether it's a megawatt or 100 megawatts, it shouldn't really matter. You build the energy asset that the resource allows you to build, but then you have that buyer that comes along with the flexibility to take only what's not needed by somebody else.
I do want to revise my answer. You wanted a quicker answer. The metric is ESG dying is like
That's the number one metric.
That I was thinking.
Are you guys not
That's
going to
the
give that a
metric.
round of applause? Like
Well,
that sounds fantastic.
well, I think the DEI stuff is taming down, but the ESG stuff needs to tame down because it'd be a very good thing if we can get more power online faster and of all forms, like not just my favorite coal, but like natural gas, nuclear, everything. So like getting the bureaucrats out of the way and letting the engineers build infrastructure. And I'm hopeful that's going to start happening again because now that they make a lot of money on AI kind of things, and maybe they'll drop the shtick, like the ESG stick, and like go back to reality.
I don't know what you're doing here, bro. You should be in Davos representing the rest of us. I got an interesting question for Taras. If you had 200 sites of 1 megawatt each, do you get the same grid value as 200 megawatt flexible facility?
Well, that depends on the grid itself. And I mean, it goes back to CapEx intensity. The cost to generate a kilowatt is not the same based on scale. I mean, to develop a 100 megawatt site, driving down your overall CapEx for that kilowatt production is far more efficient than doing 101 megawatt sites, with an asterisk, because there's a ton of 1 megawatt sites. I was actually talking to somebody earlier today about being able to partner up with existing industrial processes where they're not utilizing their electrons properly, but you can actually park digital mining performance and operation there to generate free BTUs and actually turn that electron capacity into economic return. So if you're looking at it from a power generation perspective, absolutely 100 megawatt site is far more economically efficient. However, if you're looking at underutilized assets that are literally sitting there ripe for the picking, I would say that 101 megawatt sites would actually be very helpful, because not to say ESG is the worst thing in the world, because there's an argument there, but you can actually use that capacity to drive down carbon dioxide consumption if needed. And I don't think it's necessarily the problem that a lot of people push it to be. But I think that if you've got this capacity and you no longer need to turn on your furnace because you can create Bitcoin, why not? If you've got a facility that's down for 12 hours as you're doing a shift reload, why don't you plug in a Bitcoin miner to utilize those electrons? I mean, there is economic productivity you can squeeze out of existing infrastructure.
Steve, it really looked like you wanted to respond to that.
That's a whole separate panel, man. That
No, this is why we're here. Hit it, man.
No, I will add though that, like, when you compare like a massive, mega mine to more of what we try to specialize in, the distributed computing, it's all about the application, right? And, I already said that, but like, for example, in our niche in the oil field, there's pulling out of thin air 100,000 generators on rent and owned by industrial facilities powered by natural gas right now. I don't know what the actual number is, but let's just say there's a lot. Almost every single one is underutilized to a degree. Some of them are maxed out, but most of them, engineers oversize microgrids. You don't want to run out of power. So you have all these engines, turbines not running at full load. And the heat rates going through those power plants are inefficient when you're not at load. And so, like, when you compare like 100 megawatts in a central facility, say Bitcoin mining compute, I don't think it really applies as much to like HPC AI compute. So for Bitcoin mining compute versus 101 megawatt facilities on generators that are existing and underutilized, in the right application, that's where, it's hard to compare apples to apples, but that's something to be mindful of, because you have sunk costs in these machines, these generators, and getting them at load will dilute your overall maintenance capex per kilowatt hour produced. So.
And I'm just going to jump in. And I think, Steve and I like both come from this same mentality of, you're looking to grab that energy asset that has no other productive use. And I think a lot of times those are going to be smaller amounts of energy. And so it's about building that capacity to be, adequately efficient. So maybe you're more efficient at doing 100 megawatts, but if you're adequately efficient at 1 megawatt, it gives you that flexibility now to go to wherever you could source energy that's not being utilized. So whether it's a genset that's underpowered, or it's a hydro site that isn't selling all of their electricity, Bitcoin mining just gives us incredible ability to fill in the gaps. It's almost like putting paste on a wall to fill in all the little holes. And the truth is, that's where you get the best economics. Bitcoin mining is about getting the cheapest source of energy possible. And a lot of times those cheap sources of energy are not going to be, oh, here's 100 megawatts that nobody's using. It's going to be, here's 100 sites with 1 megawatt that's not being utilized. And so Bitcoin mining becomes that flexible load that allows us to go fill in those gaps.
And that brings us to the whole issue that folks had with all these massive pubcos controlling so much of the hash rate. As mining really becomes integrated into industrial processes globally, the decentralization issue that people had with pubcos is going to disappear, because you're going to have sites literally everywhere. Either you're heating your hot tub, providing BTUs for your HVAC, etc., creating the decentralized
steaks, apparently.
Cooking steaks. Yeah, that was pretty cool. Generating hash rate will certainly become fully integrated in the fabric of society over time.
Taurus, I have a question for you. We have to address the gorilla in the room. Let's talk about HPC and AI convergence. When miners say we can pivot to AI, what are the real blockers?
Oh boy.
They flew me out here for a reason, to add spice.
Yeah. I flew in from Hawaii yesterday, the most painful flight in a long time, sitting in Southwestern like this for 14 hours. But HPC is actually realizing that as their infrastructure needs evolve, they're getting closer and closer to Bitcoin mining. Had a lunch with head of country for Dell, and he's telling me all these cool innovations coming out with infrastructure that they're pushing soon. And I start laughing, and he's like, "Why are you laughing?" I'm like, "You know exactly why." He's like, "We're getting closer and closer to Bitcoin mining than you could ever imagine." They're taking basically all of our major key lessons from Bitcoin mining, thermal management, large load management, and applying it to HPC. And so you're seeing it in the Blackwell series, you're seeing in the Rubens, sophisticated thermal management is happening in HPC. And so I think that a lot of the skills and experience and folks that we've got on Bitcoin mining will be extremely sought after by HPC. When it comes to developing the infrastructure, obviously you need capacity for the fiber, which is very difficult in a lot of off-grid sites. I mean, there is no fiber. You can't just plug in a Starlink and expect to run an HPC load. There's power redundancy. We don't need power redundancy in Bitcoin mining. You only lose economic value if you shut down every 10 minutes versus if you're running a model that you're training. Weeks of computational effort and value can be destroyed if you lose uptime. That's why Amazon AWS has had major issues by having downtime 3 times in the past year. How do you trust a compute provider that's supposed to be 99, 999 if they're going down even once every year, right? So that's something that Bitcoin miners haven't had to deal with, but there are models that I think that are coming out that are going to balance curtailability of Bitcoin mining with the steady stream power requirements for HPC. But really, bandwidth, power redundancy, and then quality of thermal management are the 3 major issues you have to deal with.
So you mentioned a couple, but what parts of mining infrastructure are reusable and what's fantasy?
I mean, the heavy power infrastructure itself, transformers, switch gears, interconnect, all that stuff is extremely reusable. Over time, fans and all the subcomponents will also be reusable. The networking gear is not that reusable just because the bandwidth requirements are so night and day different. So yeah, it's really a lot more of the heavier infrastructure. And then as you're designing for tier 3 certification, the security aspects, I mean, Bitcoin miners, the scale of value concentration from like a CapEx perspective is totally different. Per megawatt, 7 to 10 million for HPC, depending on the tier you're building. For Bitcoin mining, it's maybe $1 million, depending on how much you're putting in and the hardware and infrastructure you're using. Security is also a very different game, like between HPC and Bitcoin mining.
Now I'm going to put on my boots and visit Steve in the fields and Philip in Africa. Let's contrast mining versus HPC. Does upstream energy work for HPC, Steve?
I would say like black and white answer, no. At least in the sense of thinking about upstream energy production being distributed, like say oil and gas is. But of course, it's not black and white. I mean, I think that Bitcoin mining and AI compute or HPC compute is vastly different. And there's vastly different risk profiles as well. I mean, I think one thing they have in common is whoever owns the hardware, like the GPU or the ASIC, is the one getting wrecked in both industries, wrecked via depreciation, the hidden costs that is often unaccounted for in both industries. And I mean, when I think about that too, I mean, I would much rather, especially nowadays, as Bitcoin mining is maturing and commoditizing, I'd rather own ASIC hardware like SHA-256 computing hardware than GPUs, because there's really probably not a big risk of SHA-256 algorithms like improving. I think there's maybe in Bitcoin's history only one event where ASIC boost. There was some innovative algorithmic optimizations, but it's basically stayed the same, right? So you're just building better, more efficient chips. AI is at risk of new algorithms completely obsoleting the current hardware. And I would be very scared if I was one of the companies that are focused on owning and leasing the GPUs, because you're at insane risk right now. But then otherwise, like mechanically, there's, I think, a lot different. Power quality is not a big deal in Bitcoin mining. We know that through experience. Running small microgrid generators, you can get through it and have blips in power, it's just really not a big deal. You can automate the system to respond accordingly. Harder to do that with AI, and the fact that every second of downtime and certainly disruption in the computing stream is going to have a much bigger impact. And that's not even to touch on all the stuff Terrace just touched on with thermal management, redundancy, other things.
So, what percentage of the year are you actually curtailing or load following, and what does that flexibility cost you?
Like us specifically, like in the upstream.
I mean, you could do a ballpark number, obviously.
Facility dependent. I mean, just like anyone, everyone wants the max uptime, but like we try to target these nasty situations where, they can't deal with the gas, and, they apply our systems, and we do have automated load curtailment as part of the design. It is facility dependent, but it could be pretty frequent, like many times a day. Like our load sync controller dropping load, coming back based on like fuel gas pressures, fuel gas availability. So it can be very high, and the overall uptime is pretty poor on some sites, but that they might still be ecstatic because they're compliant on the gas emission side, and they're making their oil, and that's what they want. So.
Philip and Taurus, would you guys say that HPC is fundamentally grid tied?
No, I don't. I think today, practically yes, but I think theoretically no. I don't know how many of you were at Imagine If, but Eric gave a talk on what we're calling the emergent grid. And I think, there are two aspects to kind of this HPC AI push. One is obviously the massive energy and infrastructure investment to do the training, but then on the other side is the inference part of the equation. And so when you look at somebody sitting in East Africa, the latency to send their request to California and get a response back is inherently poor. And so I think it's one of these things that, here people are making an AI cake with AI icing. Over there we're doing a Bitcoin cake with a thin layer of AI icing on it. And I think that ultimately does have value, not only in terms of being a higher payer for the energy, so it's a better price point for selling the electricity, but there's actually value in being able to have, within that local networking infrastructure, the ability to query and get a faster response. But that is still early days. Like, I think it's one of those things that's going to evolve out over time.
So really quickly, because I know we ran out of time, but as of right now, HPC AI is fundamentally tied to the grid for sure. You need that stable, renewable power, stable power base load to make sure everything stays up with the backup generators. But there was one comment from before around hardware redundancy where people think that you need to have the top of the line GPU hardware to maintain your requirements for HPC operations. That's not necessarily the case. And the reason being is most of the enterprise that are actually using compute for their own HPC AI needs don't need Blackwells or Rubin, as mentioned before. They could use A1000s, A6000s. So what we are going to see is this same thing we saw in Bitcoin mining. Huge fleets coming out of these massive hyperscalers and going to what I call hyposcalers, inference edge data centers, 1, 2, 10 megawatts, but located pretty much where latency is going to be low, where you can actually use the compute as an offtake versus these massive model training centers. So I think that hardware cycles will extend as we create the secondary market. My team's working on that fundamentally as we expand to digital compute, but I don't think it's necessarily the worst place to be, except for if you're buying the brand new Ferrari, if you need the Porsche or Toyota, right? Because most of the time someone's trying to upsell you, but the Toyota is perfectly fine to get to the local grocery store.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're getting to the top of the panel, so I do want to throw a couple rapid fire sentences here.
Real rapid.
Real rapid. I got you, Rod.
Rod's on your case.
Steve, the most misunderstood thing about mining as load is? Don't give multiple, bro.
Where the power comes from.
Philip, not all load matters equally. What matters is?
Getting paid.
Beautiful. Taurus, one thing you change in market/policy to reward real flexibility is?
Uptime guarantees with the actual generation.
Beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the Does All Loads Matter, where scale meets impact.